Hi, and welcome to the lecture and slideshow for Module 19, our very final module, where we'll be talking about art and social issues. Now, I've titled this rather broadly, but most of the works we'll talk about today have some sort of commentary on society or is informed by other sorts of social issues in the context of the work. So that's why I've called it this. We'll be focusing on a couple of works of art that are considered feminist art. We'll also talk about an example that deals with art and race. We'll also talk about some examples of site-specific art, that is, things that are made for a particular site, are attached very much to that site. And finally, we'll conclude with a couple examples of new media. So that is mostly things like video art and other types of installations that were not seen before. So now we're past the point that we call things modern art. We're now fully into contemporary, or sometimes referred to as postmodern art. And some of these things are a little bit older, they're about 30 or 40 years old, but there are other things that are being produced in the last 10 years that we'll be talking about today. And most of the artists that I will be mentioning today are still producing works that are in galleries, they're having exhibitions, so you can go and see them yourselves. We'll start with feminist art today. And with feminist art, this rises at about the same time as feminism, and we see art in this vein being used to communicate with a wide audience. Other artists at the same time begin working with issues of social justice, looking at things like struggles of power and privilege, gender, race, ethnicity, class, and sexual orientation. And these are a couple of the issues that we'll touch on today as well. So feminism is a movement that focuses on the history of women and their station in society. It emerges as part of the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s. And it comes in a couple of waves. If you've done any reading on the history of feminism or taken any classes that deal with it, you've probably heard of the first, second, and third waves of feminism. One of the major aims in the art world was to reclaim women artists of the past and also of the present. You maybe have noticed, I hope you've noticed, that in this course I've talked about almost no women artists. And that's partially a failing on my part, but I'm going to blame your book even more and just the culture of art history in general. Women artists are just not prized in the same way that male artists are. A lot of that has to do with historically women weren't allowed into the profession in a lot of ways, and also their role in society, according to the gendering of society, meant that they weren't allowed to do things like that. There's a lot of issues associated with why we don't talk about a lot of women artists. They're there, but we'll talk about a few today. Feminists also attacked the hierarchy of painting, sculpture, and architecture as the three major forms of art, as opposed to what we would refer to as crafts. And by crafts, I mean ceramics, textiles, jewelry making, etc. And these are fields that are largely dominated by women historically and even today. So early feminist art tends to attempt to elevate craft media. So the first work of art I want to talk about today, I'm showing you the wide view here. It's by Judy Chicago, and it's called The Dinner Party. And it's a project that dates from 1974 to 1979. You can now actually go see this in the Brooklyn Museum. For a long time, it didn't have a home. There was nowhere that it was on display, but now it's set up at the Brooklyn Museum. The artist was born Judy Cohen. Her married name was Jarowitz. She then adopted the name Chicago after her hometown because all names imposed upon her were through male social dominance. So you get your father's name or your husband's name, so she decided to choose her own. She started out working as a minimalist sculptor and then began making abstracted images of female genitalia to challenge aesthetic standards. She was very interested in collaboration, and this work, The Dinner Party, is a great example of that. This is probably the best known work of art from first wave feminism. Remember I talked about those different waves of feminism, and this is kind of in your face first wave feminism. It's a massive dining table. It's very complex. The work is made of mixed media, and it fills an entire room. And its major goal is to celebrate women and women's accomplishments throughout history. Really, Judy Chicago was the designer of the work. This took 5 years of collaborative efforts of hundreds of ceramicists, needleworkers, and china painters. What we're seeing is a triangular dining table, 48 feet long on each side. It's sitting on top of a platform that has 2,300 porcelain tiles, and written on these tiles are the names of 999 notable women in history, legend, and myth. Each side of this triangle has 13 table settings for the more famous women, for the ones they especially wanted to commemorate. And that number 13 is chosen very carefully because 13 was the number of men depicted in the Last Supper, and also because 13 is the number of witches to make up a group called a coven. I want to show you a couple of details of place settings just to give you a better sense of the intricacy of this work. So at each place setting, and here we're looking at that of Hypatia in the bottom right, in each place setting there's a 14-inch wide porcelain plate, and it can also contain ceramic flatware, so the spoon, knife, and fork, and then there's a ceramic chalice as well. It also comes with an embroidered napkin, and all of this is placed onto an elaborate table runner. The runners feature stitching and decoration that is appropriate to the historical context of each woman. The plates, as you can probably tell just from these couple of details I'm showing you, the plates are largely abstracted female genitalia because, according to Chicago, quote, that is all they had in common. They were from different periods, classes, ethnicities, geographies, experiences, but what kept them within the same confined historical space was their biological sex. So this biological sex, the female genitalia, that is what she wanted to highlight here because that is what unites them. So each place setting is just a little bit different, but they're all somewhat standardized as well. I've elected to show you these three just to show you some variety, but if you Google this, you can find so many more images of how different each of these place settings are. It's a really intensive and elaborate work. There's a lot of people who criticize the dinner party, though, because in this first wave of feminism, they're so actively trying to reclaim these women of the past that there's almost no nuance to it. It's very in your face. Here are the names of 999 women plus 39 who get their own special place settings, and here is female genitalia right in your face, basically. So it's a little too direct, is what some critics would say, and we'll see, and you can see that later feminist art becomes a bit more nuanced. So the next work I want to show you is by the artist Cindy Sherman, and we're looking today at her Untitled from 1989. Now, I'm kind of characterizing her in feminist art, but not all art historians will categorize her in that way. But she does deal with themes including the notion of the male gaze. And this is something we talked about with Olympia, and this is something that Cindy Sherman really wants to take hold of and make her own. Sherman also questions the modernist assumption that an individual can create something totally original, and that's something we see especially in the series of photographs that she does. So the work of Cindy Sherman is only the one on the right side. On the left, I'm showing you the painting by Raphael called La Fornerina that she is remaking, and she's making it her own. This is not her first series. The series that really launched her into fame occurred in the late 70s and early 1980s, and those are actually my favorite. Your book doesn't produce those, but she does this series of film stills where she poses in them. They're always a type of self-portrait, and they're quotations of well-known plots of B-list movies. That series began in 1977, and she produced more than 80 black and white film stills. She says that she got that idea from looking at softcore porn magazines and seeing the stereotypical ways that women were presented. Later, she takes these same ideas about how women are represented and beholden to the male gaze by recreating famous paintings starring her. So Cindy Sherman is almost always present in her own work. She is almost always the model being depicted. So as I said, here we have a recreation of a work by Raphael called La Fornerina. Generally, this painting by Raphael is considered to be a portrait of his mistress, and that is a private painting for the artist. So women in the Renaissance would never have been depicted like this because it's completely inappropriate, right? Remember, The Mona Lisa, for example, or Battista Sforza, or even going back to the Arnolfini double portrait, women are shown clothed in a domestic setting. Here we have a woman who is nude with a gauzy fabric she's sort of modestly pulling up over her chest, set against this foliate background. And then if you notice her armband, it actually has a signature of Raphael on it. And I always think it's this way of him sort of marking this woman as his own. So Sherman is playing around with this idea of the male gaze and who is supposed to be looking at these paintings of naked women. Sherman recreates every element, but she holds the gaze of the viewer very strongly. In this, we see a way of owning the past and retaking that notion that the woman is the object of a gaze. Now, there are some definite differences here that Sherman has elected to do. So, for example, you have a different kind of drapery covering her stomach. Notice she's wearing this sort of false torso and also showing herself as pregnant. The way she's framing that belly is reminiscent of what La Fornerina is doing, but it's very much emphasizing a pregnant belly there. She's got a garter around her arm instead of the bracelet with Raphael's signature. She's got this piecey headscarf that she's wrapped around her wigged head. But I mean, she could have elected to make this an exact replication of La Fornerina, but instead she's showing herself as this sort of housewife, this pregnant housewife. There's a certain humor in her visual punning, and I think you can see that she's very aware of the past, but she's redeploying it to make new meanings. There's a certain assertion identity that won't be beholden to the male gaze, which is so much a part of Western art. And she constructed these works with that in mind. She's concerned with issues of contemporary feminist theory. Still, she's an object of the viewer's gaze, but she is in control. This is something that should remind you of Olympia very much. These are certain roles that popular culture assigns to women, and she is adopting them and then taking control of them. She acts as a sort of receptacle of identities, and that's something she still deals with in her work today. She's a fascinating artist. She's one of my favorite contemporary artists because I think she's really playing around with a lot of smart issues, and I love that she shows her awareness of the past and finds a way to make it new and make it relevant and make it about contemporary issues. Now I would like to turn to work that is not considered feminist art, although we do have another work by a female artist. Here I'm showing you Kara Walker's Slavery, Slavery from 1997. And I can only show you a detail of this because it is actually a 360-degree circle around the viewer. Kara Walker is an African-American artist who works primarily in this medium of silhouettes. She also sometimes does work in video and drawing as well, and sometimes even combines all three of those media, but she's best known for her silhouettes. They're often done on a very large scale so that they surround and encompass the viewer with their story. Her works primarily explore issues of race, sexuality, and violence, and she does this in this very pretty silhouette form. But it also, notice that it's in the stark black and white, which is a really subtle way of focusing on the tensions created by such issues as race, sexuality, and violence. Walker was originally from California, but she moved to Atlanta as a teenager, and there she saw the realness of racism, moving from a more progressive area like California to a place in the Deep South where there was still a strong sense of racism. So the silhouette is a really old art form that eventually comes to be considered a craft. So remember I talked about that with feminist artists, and even though Walker isn't really a feminist artist per se, she's dealing with that notion of the craft and elevating it to a higher art. And there's a certain delicate quality to these cutouts, which is in really stark contrast to the subject matter that she shows. In describing her work, she has talked about how the silhouette is a perfect symbol of the flatness and superficiality of racial stereotypes. Here I have a quotation from Walker. She says, quote, "I was really searching for a format to sort of encapsulate, to simplify complicated things. And some of it spoke to me as it's a medium historically, it's a craft, and it's very middle class. It spoke to me in the same way that the minstrel show does. It's middle-class white people rendering themselves black, making themselves somewhat invisible, or taking on an alternate identity because of the anonymity, and because the shadow also speaks about so much of our psyche. You can play out different roles when you're rendered black or halfway invisible. So often her titles come from old songs, especially old Southern songs. The work here, Slavery, Slavery, as I said, is an enormous 360-degree installation. It's 85 feet long. The black silhouettes here are placed directly onto the wall, so they're paper cutouts that then are applied directly to the gallery wall. It encircles the viewer and makes him or her feel a part of it. There is not really a beginning or an end, and all of these characteristics of it can be read as a metaphor for racism. This work and many of her works depict tropes of the antebellum South, that is, the South before the Civil War, and the images are very racialized and sexualized. So in this detail, I'm showing you some things that are actually quite graphic and not as graphic as a lot of her work can be, but you can see, for example, in the very center, you see this woman who's vomiting on the ground here. You see this man over here on the right side that is just flatulating towards the woman coming this way. And actually, here's a detail that shows that area of the wall. Here we see just a snippet of the kind of things that she deals with. So, for example, on the right side here, you've got what looks to be a slave and a slave holder who is escorting him somewhere. He's holding the key to the slave's chains here, sort of shaking it in front of his face. You've got this man again down here on his knees, and this woman right behind him. And I have some theories about what this figure here is doing, but since I'm not sure, I won't say. And then the centerpiece of this area is this woman who is both anchored and active. She's shown as a fountain. You can see her female form very clearly. And she's standing on top of a crouching monkey who is perched on top of a skull. And you can see that the water of this supposed fountain is coming from all sorts of different areas of her body. So it's this sort of sexualization of the figures coming from her mouth, from her breast, from her genitals, even from her armpits. So this woman is basically turned into an object, something to be looked at, and something that is anchored to this fountain base that seems to symbolize oppression. So Kara Walker's work is really very interesting. She's still rather young. I think she's in her 40s or 50s now, and she teaches at NYU, so she's a very active member of the New York art world. I went and saw her retrospective at the Whitney that was there, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago now, and her work is just so captivating. I think she's one of the most important artists working today in the United States. So now we're going to go back about 25 years to discuss this work and move into our discussion of site-specific art. Site-specific art is a movement in the 1960s that aimed to move art out of the gallery space. Site-specific means art that is created for one site only and art that is tied inextricably to its location. It's often also associated with the environmental art or the earthworks movement. They often blur the line between architecture and sculpture. It tends to involve the landscape in some way or use natural or organic materials. We see also with site-specific art a concern for environmentalism and the depletion of natural resources. Ironically, these works are often very difficult to access, so they want to take art out of the gallery, but then they're not easy to get to. These works tend to challenge traditional assumptions of artistic creation and models, and it's a way of getting away from the art market. So site-specific art cannot be bought and sold. It's not a commodity in the same way that art became after the rise of the Academy, essentially. Well, even before that. What I'm showing you here is Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, which is in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and it was constructed in April 1970. It still stands there today, although my understanding is that it's quite eroded. Smithson is an earthworks artist. He was interested in the ongoing dialectic in nature between constructive forces, those that build and shape form, and destructive forces, such as erosion or man's encroaching onto nature. The jetty that I'm showing you here is this 1,500-foot spiraling stone and earth platform that extends into the Great Salt Lake. He chose this place because it recalls both the origins of life in the salty waters of a primordial ocean, which is what several different cultures explain as their creation myths, and it also recalls the end of life because it's a dead lake. He did have the land purchased for the project by a patron. We see here, though, an example of land reclamation. The Great Salt Lake was an incredibly polluted lake because of the digging up of shale that is used to make oil. This pollution to the lake created a haven for algae to flourish because it's one of the only organisms that can live in it. And it often actually gives the Great Salt Lake a red tint, which is rather suggestive of blood. Smithson considered the spiral the most fundamental shape in nature because it appears in galaxies, seashells, DNA molecules, and salt crystals. It suggests a perpetual coming and going and an opening and closing of things. So there's a lot going on in this work. It's not just this rock walkway. He's chosen the site very carefully. He's chosen the shape very carefully. And it's got a lot of really primordial associations with life and death and blood. I hope that some of the things I'm describing to you make you think of an earlier American artist we talked about, and that is Thomas Cole. Remember, he was also preoccupied with man's impact on nature and the effects of development and industrialization. Now, one thing I like to ask students when I'm teaching this in a classroom is, how do you feel about this being a work of art? Who gets to see it? And how is it experienced? This is not something that the New York art world can just pop up and go see. It's not going to be on display in a gallery. It takes a sort of pilgrimage to get there. And it's interesting also, I think, for patrons who might be living in Utah who don't necessarily access the New York art market on a regular basis, but they can still have art in their states. So a lot of these earthworks are really difficult to get to and difficult to see. I've never seen Spiral Jetty. I've actually never seen most of the earthworks that are reproduced in survey textbooks like your own. So it's got some good ideas behind it, but it really often removes it from the viewer. And to me, that removes a lot of the meaning of art. I mean, that's one of the ways I define art, is that a viewer is required to experience it. The next work I want to talk about in this category of site-specific art is Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., that dates from 1981 to 1983. This work was a project overseen by the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. This was a group composed mostly of veterans. They held a competition for their memorial, and in the call for the competition, they stated that it should be without political or military content. It should be reflective in character, it should harmonize with its surroundings, and it should include the names of the 58,000 dead and missing from the Vietnam War. Maya Lin was a 22-year-old Yale undergrad in architecture when she won the competition. The selection of her work was quite controversial, which your supplementary reading touches on today, the interview with the artist. Here I'm showing you an aerial view of the work. The monument consists of two 200-foot-long walls of polished black granite that come together in a wide V. Inscribed on it are the 58,000 names of the missing and the dead, and they're listed in order of their death or disappearance. The only dates listed are the first and last deaths, 1959 and 1975. Going back to this aerial view, I wanted to show you this because the walls are cut down into the earth. It starts out very small when you approach from this left side here. That's the main approach to the monument. When you start out this way, the wall is very low, and then by the time you reach the center of it as you walk, it's much taller than you are. And then the same experience happens as you walk over to the right side of this photo, and it's sort of like a gash or a cut into the earth. It became very controversial. President Ronald Reagan refused to attend its dedication, and in 1984, this bronze statue entitled The Three Fighting Men, or The Three Soldiers, was added to appease the opponents. Today, it is the most popular memorial in the U.S. Now, monuments are an interesting subcategory of public art because they become a site of collective mourning. I don't know how many of you have visited this. It's been many years since I went, but I remember going for the first time when I was really young. I was 6 or 7, I think. And I remember seeing people crying at the wall, going and rubbing the names, having to find the name first. So remember, as I said, they're listed in chronological order from the date of their disappearance or their death. And one of the reasons Lynn chose this method was so that a person's name wouldn't get lost if it was in alphabetical order. So imagine how many Joneses or Smiths or Thomases or whatever popular last name, how many of them died in the Vietnam War. And so then your loved one with that last name would sort of disappear among everybody else with the same name. Some of the other reasons it raised controversy was because it was black and because it felt like this cut into the earth. Lynn said that she wanted to make it this gash because she saw the war as this cut in society. And also she chose the black granite because it's so reflective. And that's one of the reasons I chose this photograph of the monument, because you go and you see these names and you see yourself in the monument. So it's literally taking that call, it's taking that aspect of the call for the competition of it being a place for reflection by actually making it reflective. This is an example of a minimalist sculpture, and I think it's interesting that there was so much controversy about it, how that tells us how people respond to abstract art. The style of minimalism some people thought was hard to connect with. Also, the fact that Maya Lin is of Asian descent, that was another thing that raised controversy because of the prejudices that resulted from the Vietnam War. Other people complained that there was no glorification of soldiers, that there was no patriotic undertones, and that is why this was added, for example, so that there was an emphasis on the people, on the soldiers, that a figurative monument could bring that in a way that a minimalist monument could not. And that's up for debate if you ask me. In the end, as I said, though, it's the most popular monument in Washington, D.C., and there's a lot of things that make it successful, I think. So, as I said, the black granite is very reflective. People see themselves in the names of the deceased. So it's a way to connect to this war that keeps getting further and further away in time. You can see that people leave things at the site, flowers in this little basin that's in front of the wall, other things like that, letters and stuffed animals. And that's a good indication that the monument works on some level. And now normally in this context, I would ask you what you think about the addition of this monument, the 3 soldiers, because this is actually, Maya Lin was very unhappy about this, as you read in your supplementary reading. Now I want to talk about a monument, a work of site-specific art that is no longer existing. And strangely to me, your textbook does not include this work, but it's one of my favorite things to teach in this time period of art, so I decided to teach it anyway. I'm showing you Richard Serra's Tilted Arc in its original position in the Jacob K. Javits Federal Plaza in New York City. It dates from 1981 and is made out of Corten steel. And Serra still works in Corten steel. I went to one of his exhibitions at the MoMA 6 or 7 years ago, and it was all Corten steel sculptures. So here we're seeing a monumental minimalist sculpture, and again, very site-specific. This work was originally commissioned by the government program called Art in Architecture, and it was installed in this federal plaza in New York, in front of this federal building in New York, which was a wide open plaza bordered by government office buildings. Serra's large metal arc, and hopefully you can tell that it actually tilts just a little bit towards the figures who are walking in this work. It blocked the direct flow of pedestrian traffic across the plaza, and it instead forced the pedestrians to walk around the sculpture and change the path that they normally took. The sculpture tilted slightly, and it gave many viewers the feeling that the whole sculpture was about to come crashing down on them at any moment. And hopefully you can tell from this image that it's quite tall as well, much taller than a single human figure. The employees of the federal building saw the sculpture as an inconvenience, however. Many of them detested it, and they claimed that it blocked the sun and had ruined the plaza where they liked to eat lunch. These claims were largely ignored in the beginning, as the standard complaints that go along with the installation of any new public artwork. In 1984, however, the fight about Tilted Arc began in earnest. 3 overarching arguments against the piece were that it was an improper symbol of the federal building, it destroyed the beauty of the plaza, and it prevented the plaza from being used for other purposes. So there were a whole bunch of meetings that actually took place and some controversy from a lot of people who didn't like the work of art. However, Serra continued to fight for his peace until 1989, persevering in the face of increasingly ugly claims, including that it could direct a bomb blast into the federal buildings flanking the plaza, and that it attracted rats and prostitutes. People will say anything if they don't like a piece of public art. In 1989, Tilted Arc was finally removed from the plaza space. Serra refused to relocate the sculpture despite many offers for it to be purchased because he said it was a site-specific design. However, as late as 1996, the original sculpture is still located in a waterfront parking lot in Brooklyn because it is extremely heavy. And so now it just sits by the water in Brooklyn on its side, and nobody gets to see it because Serra was stubborn, and so was everybody else. And here I'm showing you what the plaza looks like today. So there's still this scar in the middle of this plaza from Tilted Arc. So even though the piece is gone, it's still making its mark in this very specific site. I think it's a really interesting example of the issues surrounding public art, the issues of minimalist art as public sculpture, and what artists will say and do in order to have their works kept in place, to have their works kept in the site that they were intended to be in. The next artist I want to talk about is actually a pair of artists, Christo and Jean-Claude, and I'm showing you their project called The Gates Project for Central Park, New York, and it dates from 1979 to 2005. Christo and Jean-Claude's works are a very good example of public art. It's art in the public sphere, out of the gallery space, and it provides the viewer less of an opportunity to reject his role. You can't avoid something like this, whereas if you don't want to go see art, you don't have to go to a museum. Christo and Jean-Claude take on huge spaces in their projects. They take on buildings, natural landscapes, islands, and they generally use fabric to either wrap them, enclose them, surround them, or decorate them. Their projects take years and years to realize. As you can see, the dates for these are 1979 to 2005, because they need to get permits from governments and local city councils, and they often have to deal with controversy from local citizens. They make their money from the sales of preparatory sketches and designs, and the works themselves are never for profit. They pay for the entire work. They don't require any money from the government or the people who live in the areas around these works. This project was an installation in Central Park that lasted from February 12th until February 27th, 2005, so it was only up for about 2 weeks. The project consisted of 7,503 gates along 23 miles of pathways. Each gate ranged in width depending on the walkway it covered, but they all consistently hung to about 7 feet off the ground. These were free-hanging orange panels. They refer to the color as saffron, and they waved in the wind, and I like this photo for that reason. You can see them blowing in the wind. These are really dynamic works of art. The stiff frames that you see are meant to reflect the grid-like city blocks of New York City, while the waving fabric was supposed to be like the organic forms of the park. It was a non-invasive project in that there were no holes put in the ground. Here you can see they were all built on their own platforms, and then everything could be removed. And after it was finished, all of the materials were recycled. Now, a lot of people didn't like this work of art, but some people really did because it brightened the barren winter landscape. And I wanted to show you a couple of the drawings associated with the Gates project. Here I'm showing you a drawing by Christo from 1979, laying out the general framework of the project, showing some measurements for the gates, for the fabric, for how far apart they would be. And then here I'm showing you a drawing and plan mocked up in 2003, again by Christo, showing what they hoped it would look like in this winter landscape. Now in the map above, you can see just how much of the park it covered. It was extremely thorough. It was, almost every single part of the park was touched. Now, unfortunately, I didn't live in the Northeast in 2005. I lived in Colorado at that point, so I did not get to see this, but maybe some of you actually did. I would love to hear about that if you got to go see it. So with Christo and Jean-Claude, their works are very much about public involvement and public investment in their works. It's about bringing a community together and having conversations about what art is, who gets to decide, and other issues like that. People didn't want this installed. They thought that it defaced the landscape. They complained about what was going to happen to the birds who flew through the park, or that it would obstruct the walkways. A 2008 documentary made about the gates attests that it brought 4 million visitors from around the world to the park just to see the gates. So this one was very well publicized before it went up, and when it was up, there were photographs circulating everywhere online. You could easily see it even without seeing it. So today in the module, I have links to a couple of videos about another Christo and Jean-Claude project called Running Fence, which is a really fascinating documentary, and there's a clip from that documentary that you'll find online. Their works are really interesting, I think. They're temporary, they're ephemeral, they don't last long, even though their dates say something like from 1979 to 2005. Jean-Claude died a couple of years ago, and I haven't heard anything about any new projects in the works, but if you keep your eyes open, I'm sure Christo will come up with something sometime soon. So for the final part of our class, I want to turn to a couple of works that can be labeled as new media. And I'm showing you here 2 film stills from Bill Viola's The Crossing from 1996. This was a video and sound installation that had 2 different screens of color video projection, and these screens were 16 feet high. This is a good example of new media, where we see the adoption of new technologies for artistic production, especially video and computer graphics. Viola is mostly a video artist, and he's done many video installations. What's really funny to me about this work is I actually saw this when I was 16 years old, and I traveled to France with my grandparents, and I was in the city of Avignon in southern France. And I walked into the Papal Palace in Avignon, into this dark room, this huge room, and at either end was a screen, and I saw this film that Viola made. Now, when I was 16, I didn't know anything about art history. I liked going to museums, but I didn't care that much. So when I learned about this later, it was this really incredible moment for me that I was like, oh my God, I saw that. So Viola's works, and this work I think in particular, are all about a sensory experience. And often his works are also an exploration of the spiritual. Viola studied religious mysticism for years. His works encourage spectator introspection. He often uses slow motion, contrasts in scale, shifts in focus, editing techniques, and multiple layered screens to enhance the effect on the viewer. So in this work in particular, there's 2 16-foot screens, and when I saw them, they were posted on either end. I mean, they were probably 20 feet apart, something like that, so you could stand in the middle of them. I imagine they could be displayed side by side as well, sort of like you see in this image I'm showing you. At the beginning of the video, a shadowy figure walks forward toward the viewer from the background on both screens. On one screen, a drip of water starts, and on the other, a small fire starts at the figure's feet. Over the course of several minutes, the fire and the flood increase in intensity and volume until the figure is completely consumed. And then as the video ends, the figures are gone, and so is the fire and the water. Bill Viola is very interested in the nature of these elements, these primal elements that we have in this world. And it's a pure sensory experience. It feels very real. It's very loud to have that rush of water and the flames. I mean, it really feels like it's happening right in front of you. The figure is over life size, and you're just sort of overwhelmed by what's happening. And these are sort of the themes that Viola likes to explore in his other works as well. So for the final image of this lecture and of our class in general, I'm showing you 2 stills from Matthew Barney's Cremaster 4, The Loughton Candidate from 1994. Matthew Barney is a really well-known contemporary artist, still working, mostly works in video, and he's well known for this Cremaster cycle, which was a video cycle of 5 feature-length films shot on 35mm film. Barney is known for a blurring of boundaries on what constitutes art and media. The Cremaster cycle is a vast and complex multimedia and interdisciplinary spectacle. At the Guggenheim, there was a show held in 2003 featuring the Cremaster cycle, all of the videos, And it also involved drawings, photographs, sculptures, videos, films, and performances that were all part of the show. So the person that springs to mind that he's most like is Bernini, this mixing of media, but I don't think you'll see Bernini dyeing his hair orange and sporting goat ears anytime soon. So this word cremaster, it's actually the name of the muscle that controls testicular contractions in response to external stimuli. So this process of sexual differentiation is the foundation of the entire work. He makes reference to lots of different things in the video. He makes reference to a musical taking place in Boise, Idaho, the life cycle of bees, the execution of a convicted murderer, the construction of the Chrysler Building in New York, Celtic mythology, Masonic rituals, a motorcycle race, and an opera set in 19th century Budapest, to name just a few things. His films are this immersion into the artist's completely constructed world, but it's done on the scale of contemporary life, and the use of video. These two things help to suck you in and overwhelm you. Now, I've never seen any of his cremaster videos because they're actually kind of hard to get a hold of. They're not available for sale generally. Sometimes there will be showings of them in movie theaters. But I think I'd really like to see them because Matthew Barney is considered such an important artist right now, and these works are considered to be his seminal works of art. If you ever get the chance to see them, I would definitely take the opportunity. So we covered a lot today. As always, we talked about a couple of examples of feminist art with Judy Chicago and Cindy Sherman. We also talked about art and race, specifically with Kara Walker. We also talked about site-specific art, looking at such monuments as Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, and Christo and Jean-Claude's The Gates. And there's this really significant interest in public interaction with these site-specific works of art, especially with somebody like Christo and Jean-Claude. And then we concluded today with new media, looking at the video works of Bill Viola and Matthew Barney. So to finish Module 19 and to finish this class, you have a self-assessment to take. You also have a journal entry that's in relation to the videos of Christo and Jean-Claude's work, Running Fence. The vocabulary wiki is the responsibility of Group 3. Your final paper is due August 16th. And finally, your weekly quiz is actually due on Saturday this time because the semester ends on Saturday. So good luck finishing everything up, and I will see you in our synchronous meeting.